Peter? Right, so just as a very brief introduction, John is an archaeologist by sort of background and profession, and he was the curator at the Stranraer Museum at the same time as David Devereux was the curator of the Stewartry Museum. So he's well aware of Kirkcudbright and what he does, and as you will see, he's talking about mining archaeology. So you're very welcome, John, and without further ado, I shall look forward to hearing you on our talk.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Good, good-o. Yes, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Kirkcudbright History Society, for asking me to come along tonight. Mining archaeology in Dumfries and Galloway. Mining was never really a big part of the local economy, with the notable exception of Wenlock Head. But mining has left what I think is very interesting heritage, some fascinating physical remains of the mining industry. And it's that industrial archaeology that I really want to look at tonight. Now, Wenlock Head is a site which I'm sure you all know, and many of you will have visited. It's a really quite fascinating museum there. And Wenlock Head is a fascinating place. Mining here stretches from the early 1600s, if not earlier, right through to the 1950s. And it is, together with the neighbouring site of Lead Hills, the most well-preserved mining landscape in Scotland, and one of the best actually in the UK. But the very importance of Wenlock Head has rather overshadowed the fact that there were lots and lots of other mines elsewhere in our region. And it's those other mines I'd really like to look at tonight. So here's Wenlock Head. You all know where that is. Where are the other mines, and how many of them are there? Well, as you can see, there are a lot. The whole region, especially Kirkcudbrightshire, is pockmarked with abandoned mines. There's lead, there's copper, there's iron, and there's more obscure minerals like antimony, arsenic, nickel. There's even gold. And of course, way over here in the Cannonby area, in a small coalfield, and up at Sanker, Kirkconnell, we're really looking at the Dumfriesshire extension of the Ayrshire coalfield. But it's really metal mines I want to talk about tonight, and especially lead and copper. Now, we haven't got time to really talk about the history of these mines, but suffice it to say that the vast majority date from the 18th through to the middle of the 19th century, and again, the vast majority were fairly small concerns, attempts by local estates to explore their mineral reserves, really as part of estate diversification, if you will. But one or two mines were on a larger scale. Up here by Carstfairn, we have the Woodhead mine, working in the 1840s through the 1870s, and developed by the local estate under Cathcart MacAdam, one of the larger lead mines, certainly in southwest Scotland. And then we go down towards the Newton Stewart area. There's a mine here at Black Craig, probably the largest of the lead mines outside of Wenlock Head. Began working in the 1760s and continued intermittently right through until about 1919. The other mines, I really put the names up because I'll be mentioning these during the talk to give you some idea of location. But as you can see, we've got a real concentration in that area, really from Creetown through to Newton Stewart, up the Cree Valley, ending up at Carstfairn here. Then a scatter of copper mines along the Auchencairn coast, and then some oddities like Tondagee here by Whithorn, and the Knocky Bay mine over here by New Luce. Our American friend Polly, well, I'm sure loves some of these names. Tondagee and Knocky Bay for starters. So it's one of the good names as we go along. As an Englishman, I hope I'm pronouncing them correctly, but you'll tell me otherwise. Okay, metal mining really is a process. And the way I'll try and organize the talk is by looking at the archaeology that relates to these various parts of the process. Prospecting for metal, mining the metal ore, when you've got the metal out of the ground, separating that ore from the waste, provide a rich metallic concentrate, and then smelting that concentrate to produce the final metal, whether it be lead or copper or even gold. So, prospecting, as you will have seen from that earlier slide of the distribution of mines, a great number of them are actually on the coast. And obviously, if you've got a mineral vein exposed on the coast, it's comparatively easy to see. I'm sure that many of our early mines were first discovered by people either sailing the coast or walking the cliffs and seeing these unusual exposures of colourful metal ores. An example here is Tondagee near Whithorn. I'm intrigued by this one, actually, just as an aside. Tondagee apparently in Gaelic means, you'll excuse this, arse to the wind, which I think is this very exposed coastal location. So here we are at the arse to the wind copper mine. The red line here shows the copper vein exposed on both sides of a small coastal promontory. And during the early 18th century, the shaft was sunk here to explore the centre of the vein. A tunnel or level was driven in here. Another shaft was sunk here. And also here, the vein itself has been quarried away in a big open cast working. And to give you some idea of the historical depth of this site, you can see that the mine workings overlie a series of probably early post-medieval field systems. You can see the Riggan furrow here. And here's just a view of that quarried open cast where this vertical vein of copper has been completely removed and taken away. Now, what you won't see tonight is what happens underground, principally because the vast majority of the mines in southwest Scotland are impossible to get into, and the few that are have not so far been very well recorded, although hopefully that is something which is going to change over the next few years. But to give you some idea of the underground workings, here's a contemporary plan from the 1840s of the Woodhead lead mine at Carsfairn. And it looks like, as you can see, a massive spaghetti. Can we make any sense of this? Well, if you think of these mineral veins as being vertical fissures going down through the rock, maybe only a few meters wide, up to maybe 100 to a kilometre, 100 meters to a kilometre long, and going down to an unknown depth. The metal was removed vertically. This is a complete opposite from coal mining, where invariably you're working a horizontal deposit. So here at Woodhead, there were two vertical veins. One here at the top, the Woodhead vein, and running parallel with it, the Gary Horn vein. A tunnel was driven to access the veins, shafts were sunk to access it vertically. And in this section at the bottom, you get a vertical slice through the mine workings. The blue tunnel here is the access level. You can see the shafts coming down and various lower levels being driven out. And when they hit the vein, they just remove vertically the mineral infill. So what sort of archaeology do we have on the surface to relate to that underground working? It takes various forms. Rarely you get this sort of thing. We actually have an open cast or quarry actually following the surface exposure of a mineral vein. This is Knocky Bay at New Luce. This is being worked in the 1780s by the Stair estate, but it might be on the site of a much earlier, I believe, medieval working. And these open cast gullies here could well date from the 13th or 14th century and relate to the monks at Glenluce Abbey. More often, shafts were sunk, vertical tunnels down onto the vein. This is an aerial view of part of the workings at Wenlock Head. The Cove vein, we know most of these date from the 1650s to the early 1700s. And here's a contemporary print drawing from the 1820s, showing how the miners accessed the workings with a simple hand roller or jack roller. Sometimes you get much bigger shafts. This is one of the very, very few photographs I've ever found of a Galloway mine at work outside of Wenlock Head. Here at Gatehouse in 1912, the Broughton estate is trying to reopen the old Henrik copper mine. And the shaft here, I think, went down about 150 feet. So a fairly major enterprise. Where the topography allowed, a tunnel, a level, was driven in horizontally to reach and access the vein. Here is the Drumruck mine, the Gatehouse, another of the mines worked just before the First World War by the Murrays of Broughton. One of the big things, or one of the big problems with any mine, especially in Galloway, was water. As soon as you got below the water table, the mines flooded and had to be pumped. And so much of the surviving archaeology we have today relates to the infrastructure of pumping, of draining the mines. This drawing at the bottom shows a simple water wheel working these things called flat rods, horizontal rods coming out. They go backwards and forwards, and then through reciprocating action work a vertical pump rod going down the mine shaft to actually raise the water out from the flooded workings. The black and white photograph shows how one of these water wheels would have worked or would have looked. This is an example from Coniston in the English Lake District. And over here we have the remains of one of the wheel pits, 4 of these water wheels, at the Silver Rig lead mine at Minnigaff. This one probably dates from the 1820s or 1830s. And there's maybe, let's say, just under 10 of these examples of these water wheel pits still surviving in Galloway. Very nice example here at the Coldstream Burn lead mine, again near Minnigaff. You'd have had a water wheel in here, probably about 35 foot in diameter, working flat rods going to a shaft round about here. And of course, there was a huge infrastructure that went with the water wheels. You needed reservoirs, you needed lathes carrying the water from the reservoirs to the wheels themselves. So in the landscape around the mines, you often get a very complicated water management system. This little photograph at the bottom right shows one of the reservoirs, the Weaver's Dam as it's called, for the Woodhead lead mines. And then very rarely, we actually get examples of some of the water wheels surviving. This is another wonderful little site called Crunchy, near Kirkcudbright, way up on the hills. The mine here was developed by a group called the Pelnure Burn Exploration Company in the 1890s, looking for both lead, copper, and a certain amount of arsenic in this area. The mine was very, very small. The flooded shaft can be seen here, and these bits of ironwork are part of the pumping mechanism. And up here, top left, we can actually see the axle in situ for the water wheel itself. The timber spokes have long since gone, but the basic frame is still there. And this is probably the only example in the whole of Scotland of an in situ water wheel at a local or at a metal mine. Another bit, a very rare survivor, is this lump of cast iron near Telnothery, another site developed by the Pelnure Burn Exploration Company. This is a thing called a balance bob. In that drawing I showed earlier showing a water wheel working flat rods, the balance bob is what turned the horizontal motion into the vertical motion in the shaft. Elsewhere, throughout most of Britain, these things have long since been taken away and scrapped. But of course, in Galloway, so many of these mines are in such remote locations, the scrap man has never got there. So here, surviving in a bit of old Forestry Commission land, is this rare angle bob from a water-powered pump. Better known, of course, are things like this, the Wenlock Head bucket pump. I'm sure many of you will have seen this and marvelled at it. Essentially, it's a water-powered beam engine. Here on the left, you can see the beam pumps coming down here, on the right down the shaft. There would have been a big bucket, bucket at this end, which filled with water. The weight of the water in the bucket lifted the pumps up, the bucket emptied, the weight of the pump rods would take the beam back down again. And you get this up and down motion pumping the mines. The only one to survive in Scotland. But were they being used elsewhere in Galloway? We don't know, but there are some intriguing hints. The new statistical account, the Cards Fen parish, talking about the Woodhead lead mines, has this single sentence which talks about the beautiful balance machine first invented by Brindley. Now I'm guessing this is probably some sort of water-powered balance pump. And here on this photo, taken in the 1890s after the mine had closed, you can see something, some strange mechanism, which I'd like to think might be this mechanism. When you go on site today, that's what you see. Just a mass of spread rubble. The tips here have long since been reworked and taken away as road metal. But there may still be some archaeological survival there of what was called the beautiful balance machine. And just a throwaway, who was Brindley? Well, we don't know, but there was a guy called James Brindley, a famous English canal engineer, who also worked on some water-powered pumps at coal mines in the Manchester area. Could he be the same man? The only problem is he was dead by 1772, and the mines here at Woodhead didn't start until the 1840s. So do we have a local engineer, another Brindley, working in the 1840s, 1850s? And if so, who is he? So some research to be done there by someone. Another mystery, and this is actually moving into the world of coal rather than metal. Over on the Cannonby coalfield at Bioburn Foot, there's a small coal mine there. The old statistical account has this thing. It says, coal was wrought by a water engine upon a new construction which has been invented by Mr. William Kerr, the Duke's factor. This is the Duke of Buccleuch, the Duke's factor at Cannonby. Now, the shaft was by this building. Through the woods, we can follow the lade that brought the water to this water engine. And I do wonder if this rather strange building, built on the steep cliffside here above the river, could actually be an engine house for Mr. Kerr's water engine. Again, lots of questions. And one of the things we do know about metal mining, or mining in general in Galloway, is there are so many questions we can ask. There's so much research that's waiting to be done. A few of the mines locally, especially the deeper mines, the bigger deep mines, were actually used steam pumps to try and drain them. One of the earliest outside of Wenlock Head were the Black Craig mines at Minnie Gaff. There was certainly a steam engine at work here by the 1770s, only some 5 years after the mines opened up. You can see on this little map, this road map, bottom right, from 1776, it marks lead mines here. A bit further up the road we have fire engine, and that was the steam pumping engine. The shaft is still there, and if we were to excavate around the shaft top, we would undoubtedly find the foundations of this quite early steam pumping engine. And again, just as an aside, you'll see there that the engine shaft here is 100 fathoms deep. All the old mine plans show mine depth in nautical fathoms rather than feet. Not quite sure why. Not just a Scottish thing, mines throughout the whole of Britain use fathoms to measure their depths. We have one very well preserved steam pumping engine at the Pibble mine at Kirkcudbright, a copper and lead mine opened up in the 1850s and 1860s. And we actually know quite a bit about the engine that was in here. We know it was purchased from the St. Austell foundry in Cornwall in 1852. It would have been transported by ship all the way up to the Solway and taken by horse and cart up onto the mountain here, and the engine erected inside this marvellous stone engine house. But what's more interesting in some ways is that this engine house, with its tall curved windows and big granite side coins, is typical Cornish vernacular architecture. It's exactly the same as the engine houses you see today in the tin and copper mines on the Cornish coast. And so it seems that they didn't just bring the engine up from Cornwall, but they must have brought men, or the engineers who came to erect the engine were also familiar with local building styles, and so built a Cornish engine house to house this imported Cornish engine. There are a couple of other Cornish engine houses in the area. None have survived. The best other example is here at Cairn, where this pile of rubble spread on the hillside, just inland from the coast, is the remains of another Victorian Cornish beam engine. The site was then later reused in the 1940s and 50s as a Baroques processing mill. But again, we just do some subtle archaeology here. You could quite easily uncover the remains of the engine house and its associated infrastructure with boiler houses and so on. Once you've got the ore out of the mine, you have to start processing it. And the first thing you have to do is to crush it down to a fairly fine powder, which will then allow you to separate the ore from the waste. On the left here, we can see a close-up of part of that photograph I've used before of the Woodhead mine. You can see here, I think, quite clearly a big water wheel and some machinery next to it. This, we know, was the crushing machine used at Woodhead. And again, there's this reference that says below, the wheel used for moving the crushing apparatus at Woodhead is about 30 feet in diameter, driven by water obtained from the neighbouring mountains. In this diagram to the right is a Victorian drawing showing how these crushing mills worked. Essentially, the ore is brought in, dropped down a hopper, and there are three large cast iron mangles, three big rollers, operated by the water wheel, which, one after the other, crush the ore down to a smaller and smaller size. The size they're looking for is something around about bean size. And that would be the size of the crushed ore coming out of the bottom here. Again, outside of Wenlock Head, not many sites survive, with the exception of Pibble, where we have, up on the hillside by the engine house we've just seen, a very, very large reservoir. And blades go from the reservoir down the hillside to this wonderful bit of masonry, with a huge wheel pit here. A 60-foot water wheel was in the pit, and this worked crushing machinery in this building at the side here. The whole thing is still there, but right in the middle is a very mature rowan tree. And each year it gets bigger and bigger, and each year the stonework is threatened more and more. I took this photograph about 10 years ago. I've not been back to the site since. I hope it's still there. When you've crushed it, the next thing is to try and separate the crushed ore from the crushed waste. And that's done generally by gravity separation in water. The crushed copper, the crushed lead is heavier always than the surrounding waste. By washing it in water, you can ideally wash away the lighter waste, leave the heavy ore behind. Various machines were used to achieve this, but archaeologically, what you mainly see are these heaps of crushed waste, the so-called dressing floors. When you dig down into these, as they have done at Wenlock Head, there is remarkable survival, not just of stone features, but also of timber. What they found at Wenlock Head was the remains of one of these things called a buddle, which was used for as a sort of a rotary machine, again worked by a water wheel, that finally separated crushed lead from the waste. You can see here the excavated plan of the buddle, and here on site are the remains of it. Next to it, some other timber bits and pieces of other forms of ore separation equipment. Dressing floors survive elsewhere in Galloway. This photograph shows one at the Black Craig mines, and you can see intriguing bits of timber sticking up through the waste, which demonstrates quite well that there is below very, very well preserved timber archaeology relating to the dressing machinery. The archaeology is there. These sites have no conservation on them. There's no preservation allowed. They're really quite susceptible to damage. And it'd be a shame if we were to lose these at some point in the near future. And then we occasionally get unique little bits of dressing survival. Here at the wood of Cremine, again near Minigaff, you can see these concrete foundations. Not much to look at, but they're in fact the only surviving site in Scotland of a thing called an Elmore flotation plant. This, in the early years of the 20th century, was state-of-the-art flotation equipment. Specialist mills were set up, which allowed chemicals to be used for the fine separation of zinc from lead and zinc and lead from other minerals. The photograph bottom right shows an example of one of these Elmore plants in Cornwall. The site now is part of the RSPB Nature Reserve, very quickly going back to nature itself. Again, it's got no scheduled designation, but it is a really quite unique site and a very, very rare and important survival. When you process the lead, you've got the concentrate, you then have to smelt it. Most of the smelting was done in things called ore hearths, which are very much like large blacksmith hearths. Again, the blast for the hearth coming from water wheels. A very nice excavated and preserved example at Lockhead Head, and a painting here from the 1780s down in the National Gallery showing one of the hearths at work in Lead Hills. We have a couple of quite nice survivals elsewhere in Galloway. The best one again is at Woodhead. Returning again to that photograph I've shown you 3 or 4 times, this shows the actual lead smelting mill itself. The ore hearths were in here. This was a thing called a slag mill, where the slag from the smelting process was reworked to try and get any surviving lead out of it. And the building here was the silver refinery. With at Woodhead, the lead itself contained quite a high proportion of silver, which could be retrieved by secondary smelting from the lead ores. And on the ground today, we can still see the foundations of most of those buildings. This is a survey that was done about 20 years ago, but you can see the foundations of the refinery, the slag hearth building, and the ore hearths. The beginnings here of these flues, which ran up the hillside to a series of chimneys. The chimneys created a draft in the flues, helped with the operation of the smelting hearths. They also allowed secondary lead concentrates to form within the tunnel. And one of the less pleasant jobs for any mining community was to go up with the flues periodically and scrape the lead flume off the inside of the tunnels, take it outside and rework it again in smelt mills, working there in a highly dangerous, highly toxic environment. The chimneys, or the chimney and a half, still survive just, but a bit like that water wheel crusher at Pibble, are in a fairly parlous state. They probably won't survive many more winters, but we were able, with help from Historic Environment Scotland some years ago, to have a detailed stone-by-stone survey done of the chimneys. So when and if they fall, we at least have a good record of what was there. One other nice survivor, although again, complete archaeology if you like, is the Smelt Mill, the West Black Craig lead mine, dating from the 1770s possibly. And by these earthworks, it looks as if we have very well preserved foundations there. Many of you will have probably driven past this without realizing, because here is the 866 on its way to Newton Stewart. This is just by the Black Craig turnoff. The next time you're driving along, have a quick look in the field. You'll see the humps and bumps of the mill. Now, at Black Craig, they began smelting the lead locally. They then found it was cheaper, more economical, to send the lead over to North Wales, have it smelted. Some of the cheapest and the most obtainable coal reserves were in North Wales. And so this dam was built here on the tidal Palneo burn. And the lead from the Black Craig mines, then from Pibble, was taken here, put into low sloops, which then sailed down the Solway and south to Chester and Flint, where the lead was smelted. And then coal from North Wales was brought back to Galloway as part of the exchange journey. And the Welsh connection was really quite important for Galloway mines. Many of the companies had Welsh investment. There was Welsh money, or Deeside money at least, being put into mines. And occasionally we have evidence for the miners themselves. This is in Whithorn Old Kirkyard, a fascinating headstone which says, erected by Thomas Powell in memory of his cousin George Harrison, miner in Tondagee, a native of the parish of Wrexham, Denbighshire, North Wales, died at Whithorn, 1825, aged 31. So here we've got a guy, lead miner, possibly a coal miner, from Denbighshire, who comes up to work the copper mines here in Galloway and sadly dies. We know no more about him. A quick look at some other sorts of surviving archaeology. Most of the mines, the smaller mines, had combined bothies, come offices, come smithies. The one at the bottom there is at Silver Rig, dating from the 1840s. The one at the top is shown on Stair estate plans going back to the 1760s as Mine House. We've got a very early example there at Knocky Bay of an early mine building, smithy, come office, come bothy. You also get stranger buildings. All the mines use black powder for explosives. It was quite important the explosives were kept at some distance from the other buildings. So often on the hillsides away from the mine, you get the explosive magazines. A very good example here at Wood Head. You can see here in the distance, that's the chimney for the Smelt Mill. The mine is down here, and up on the hillside, away from the main mine, you have the explosives building, the powder house. The other interesting thing, uniquely interesting about the Galloway mines, is that because of their location and the need to provide benefits for skilled miners to encourage them to come in, planned mining villages were built. Again, Wood Head provides our best example. Here, the estate, to try and bring miners in and their families, not only provided accommodation, we see one of the rows of miners' houses here in the foreground, but they also provided the school and the library. That's the building here. So the miners' children were taught here by the teacher paid for, provided by the estate. And a small library, a bit like the libraries at Lead Hills and Wenlock Head. Again, it's a benefit for the miners and their families. Had very good preservation of some of those buildings, as well as the long rows built for the lead miners themselves. There was some segregation down by the Smelt Mill. There were a series of cottages built for the smelters themselves. And up on the top of the hill, overlooking the whole of the mine, Office Row, which was the manager's house. So from his vantage point, his eyrie, he'd look over the whole of the mine and keep an eye upon it and its workings. Another well-preserved example, Black Craig, Minigaff, still standing as a fairly complete village up until the 1950s. Since then, most of the buildings have decayed. You only have the foundations left, but it's still possible to walk up this road and see the outlines of the various cottages where the miners lived. This is a much earlier village, probably dating to the 1770s, 1780s, and again provided not by the state, but by the mine company. It was also known as Path Village, the Mines Village, and Craigton. And moving to the far southeast of our region, a village still lived in, Rowanburn, Cannonby, a mining village built for the Duke of Buccleuch's colliers, the Rowanburn collieries. Again, the buildings here dating from the 1850s. And I think there are 5 parallel rows. And the architecture here is almost like the mining villages you see in Fife. It's like a little bit of the East Coast brought down to Galloway. So what we're looking at so far have really been the individual parts of the mine. At some mines, and again, Woodhead is a good example, we can actually see a mining landscape. This is a survey which CFA Archaeology did for the Museum Service back in the early 2000s of a number of our Galloway mines. This shows the extent of the mining remains there. These blue blobs, the shafts, were sunk on the 2 parallel mineral veins. And here is the level of tunnel that went in to access those workings underground. The area here is the dressing floors where the mineral was brought out from the main shafts and was crushed and washed and processed. And here, just below it, the Smelt Mill, with the Smelt Mill buildings and the chimneys running up to these high-level flues. And then, as you mentioned earlier, the village itself, top of the hill, the manager's house, miners' rows further down, the school and library down here, and here, directly opposite, the smelting mill, the housing provided for the smelters themselves. We can see a similar pattern with the Black Craig mine, and some of the smaller examples, things like the Glendinning and Timony mine near Westerkirk, which was built in the 1790s with its own model village. The last few pictures are really to make us think about threats. None of these sites were built to last. We're looking really at functional architecture. Once the mine finished, once the machinery was removed, that building's life had finished. So it's remarkable in some ways that these buildings have survived as long as they have done, but nearly all of them are under some form of threat. Here's a contrast between 1976 and 2016 of the Pibble mine. You can see how a big chunk of the engine house wall has collapsed over the last 30 or 40 years. Unless there's some form of remediation on this site, that level of gradual decay will continue. A bigger threat perhaps is erosion through flooding and storm damage. Really as part of global warming, something which will only get worse. Very, very hard to mitigate against this. But some examples here of the results of storm damage at Wenlock Head about 8 years ago. Ripped through one of the lathes, cut through part of the dressing floors, and carried away quite a big chunk of one of the water wheel pits here. The problem is you can't really preserve these sites. What you can do is try and record them before they're damaged further. Forestry has been a big threat to mining remains in the past. This was a view of the Silver Rig mine taken in the 1960s. That whole site today is pretty much covered in forestry. Little islands remaining where these buildings have been planted around, but not over. There was quite a bit of damage at Telnothery in 2012. I was alerted to this by a fellow sort of mining historian. I got in touch with the Forestry Commission. They were quite concerned themselves. They hadn't realised that this damage had taken place because at that point the arsenic mine wasn't on their records. Neither was it on the records of the county council, the regional council. And they said, well, unless we know these things are here, we can't preserve them. But they did carry out a survey of all the known mines in the Galloway Forest Park, which means we now have on their database a list of all the mines. So future planting will take the mining archaeology into account and hopefully will mitigate against any further damage. Some things just have to go because they're now the wrong thing in the wrong place. This is the 1950s miners' canteen at Glen Creek mine at Wenlock Head. As you can see, most of the roof and the sidewalls are asbestos, and the Buccleuch estate, quite rightly I think, were worried about damage from asbestos and the effect of that on visitors. And so for health and safety reasons, that building had to be demolished. It's a loss. It's not a very interesting structure, but it's an important part, or it was an important part, of the total archaeology of the Wenlock Head landscape. Some sites have been given protection by the Scottish Government. So we have, 5 sites, including Wenlock Head, are now scheduled ancient monuments. You can see here at Wenlock Head, the purple shows the areas which are scheduled where no further damage can take place without prior notification. And you can see butting against it, top right, a similar scheduled area covering the mining remains at Lead Hills. If you look more closely, you can see these areas of brown. These are areas which are out with the scheduling, but are recognised as being archaeologically important by the local historic environmental record run by Dumfries and Galloway Council. So in terms of planning, any development in these brown areas would have to take mining archaeology into account. We see that again here at Cannonby, where the site is not scheduled, but parts have been recognised as archaeologically important by the historic environment record. And as I say, any sort of planning within these areas will have to take the archaeology into account. But the most important thing, I think, is we can't save these sites to make sure that they are fully recorded for posterity. At Glendinning, the antimony mine near Westerkirk, you see here part of a very detailed survey, topographic survey, carried out by the old Royal Commission some sort of 25 years ago. More recently, they did similar work here at the Clondagee copper mine, the site we mentioned right at the very beginning of this talk. So with these very detailed plans, combined now with modern digital photography, we can get fairly accurate records of what is here. So should there be damage in the future, which undoubtedly there will be, we at least have a sort of basic record to go back to. And I'll leave you with this picture. We'll be looking very much at buildings, at tips. We'll be looking at the physical infrastructure and archaeology of mining. But ultimately, it's all to do with people, isn't it? It's to do with the miners, mining companies, the mining families. This photo shows a guy called Frank Hughes, who was working the Auchencairn copper mine in the 1950s. This was the last working copper mine in Scotland. It didn't last very long. These guys actually were mining varieties. They'd come over, a group of them from Coniston in the English Lake District, to work the varieties mines further along the coast. But most of them had a background in copper mining in Cumbria. And so almost as a hobby, they began reworking the old Auchencairn copper mine. And so I think it's quite nice to sort of finish this talk, not with a bit of archaeology, but with Frank Hughes, true blue miner. Okay, thank you for that. That's the end.